Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Alexander Lashley. It's Not Just in Your Head is hosted by psychotherapist Dr. Harriet Frodd, addiction and substance misuse disorder counsellor Ikoi Hero, and myself, editor and producer Liam Tate. This podcast is entirely funded by listeners, and as the famous meme states, we are critiquing capitalism because we are forced to participate in it in order to survive. So if you can afford to support the podcast, then your contribution will ensure that we can keep making this show. However, if you can't, then please just tell your friends about us, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, and YouTube.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
The meaning of Mark Fisher, the general theme of your book, I took to be about, at its essence, creative resistance to capitalism with a focus on art and the sort of online environment. Hopefully that's a fair sort of reading. Yeah, for the completely sort of uninitiated, could you explain maybe briefly who Mark Fisher was and why he still remains an important figure?
Okay, yeah. Well, Mark Fisher is a British theorist who, sadly, he left us in 2017. And he was greatly respected in his last years as a theorist of culture in the kind of mold of the critical theory. And his main contribution, or the thing that I think really enthused people, was a connection he made between capitalism and depression, or what he called a depressive hedonia. So he really kind of captured this phenomenon of people kind of enjoying themselves, but at the same time not, of being maybe stuck in their enjoyment and enjoyment not really kind of coming to full fruition. And yeah, he inspired a lot of people, and then, you know, just became massive in the last few years since he took his life. Online, he became massive as a meme, being talked about on podcasts and YouTube. And this in itself is very interesting because he basically said one of his main arguments was that capitalism co-opts the creative left, you know, as such, but it also co-opts kind of leftist creativity. And you see that happening with meme culture and with social media, and, you know, very strong messages being kind of, how could you say this, having their teeth blunted, you know, as they appear online, and therefore are not, you know, on the streets and are not, you know, in a sense active. They're just memes and messages which feed into the algorithm. So, you know, someone who is very well known for saying that capitalism co-opts every counter movement has now been, in a sense, co-opted as a meme. But at the same time, as a meme, he's reaching many, many people. So there's that kind of trade-off. And you know, I think I say in the book, certainly I think I say in the prior book, Can the Left Learn to Meme? I'd probably say also in this book, capitalism well, Marx said that capitalism is effectively the best and worst thing that ever happened to us. He didn't ever say exactly like that, but to paraphrase, I think that the internet is, you know, the best and worst thing that's ever happened to us. So we need to try and work out how to kind of take the positive parts and make them useful.
To your point, right, there's a great quote from Mark Fisher talking about his short-lived Boring Dystopia Facebook page, talking about crap robots. He said, and this is quoting from your book, it was just recirculating content, keeping people inside capitalist cyberspace. It was reinforcing the condition it was intended to displace. And this is a problem even, you know, do we have a problem even having this conversation in some ways, or this podcast in general? Because how do you navigate the online space? Because on one hand, this podcast very much fits with Mark Fisher's sort of idea of converting the mental health problems into, the quote being, effective antagonisms directed at capital. But on the other hand, because this podcast exists online, because we have social media pages and all that kind of stuff, are we compromised by that in the sense that, you know, you're trying to win social media or trying to get traction? And you sort of make the point that the whole online apparatus is sort of geared towards irritating people. and that, you know, just to quote you sort of directly, right-wing meme trends succeed only because the infrastructure of the internet is inherently right-wing. You know, you sort of speak about slow memes. Like, how do you see a way sort of around this problem?
Well, I guess I say slow memes because the thing about memes is they have to they have to attract attention quickly to sink in at all, or I guess they don't necessarily sink in, but to have any kind of effect on the viewer, they have to attract attention. I'm sure we'll agree it must be in a fraction of a second, really, milliseconds. And I think we need to try and get around that. I don't know how we're going to get around it. It's not like it's really happening. I don't really see many examples of slow memes. Except I'll say that actually things like podcasts and reading groups, I mean, they're a much slower use of the internet that they necessitate you slowing down to listen or to interact. So there is that. But in terms of how a meme would be slower, I think we have to consciously perhaps change our behavior in relation to the internet and be prepared to stop and really look at some things. However, most memes, because they're designed to attract attention very quickly, and they tend to be quite antagonistic, to try and do that. Or, I mean, there are other kind of aesthetics like over sexualization. But the political memes, I think we're probably thinking of in terms of left memes. Right wing memes are generally, very aggressive as a means to draw people in, or very sarcastic, or very inappropriate in some way. I think there no doubt are other things on the internet, but we have to be prepared to look out for them and to spend time with them. But to spend time with something, you do need something happening that needs reflection. So we're all in a position of trying to make things to appeal to a very fast internet. I don't know where that's really coming from. I think we have to somehow create a new online aesthetic in tandem with real life, and there has to be an overall aim at just slowing down generally. I think maybe taking on aspects of what people call spirituality or Eastern mysticism or something like that. Things actually which are deeply unpopular with a lot of Mark Fisher's followers. And this is something I'm thinking about a little bit since I wrote The Meaning of Mark Fisher, but perhaps it's kind of nodded to at the end because there's some kind of vague allusion to perhaps kind of gospel style values. But I think generally we need to stop chasing our tails. We need to basically get rid of our deep rooted fear of mortality, which drives us to want more and more power, and also to ignore basically the principal conditions of life itself. And we need to embrace what we really are, and we need to embrace the moment more. And in doing that, maybe we can also start to think about creative production methods online, which are kind of more akin to artworks, which help you to reflect, like abstract painting, like Baroque painting. It doesn't have to be painting, of course, but, works which you can kind of lose yourself in front of, or find the moment in front of. So I think it needs a massive change in mentality, and it needs to happen offline and online.
That's really interesting, actually, the idea of that the internet just has a sort of fast tempo to it. And how that bleeds out into how people treat each other online, and then how that bleeds out into the conduct in real life, because the online thing seems to be so immediate. People fire off replies very quickly that can be like incredibly mean-spirited and cutting, and then, the left are playing that same game, right? Like you make the point in the book about the sort of online left all battling each other, essentially does this job of the right for them.
Just interesting kind of, I think, for a lot of us, we've kind of gotten acclimated to this pacing over time. Because that just reminds me of somebody that was in prison for a long time, and when he came out in, I think it was 2015 or 2016, I think he said, was when he left prison. I mean, they've had access to computers, but it was like never really his thing. He's an older guy. And he came out, and, the first thing he came out, his, daughter gave him a smartphone and gave him her used laptop and said, you're going to have to, look for a job and blah, 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 right? And he was talking about how, like, overwhelming the pace was. Yeah, just the access of speed of information and speed of, he was watching like, his I think it was his grandson on Twitter, and just kind of seeing like this wall of text constantly show up.
And then that feeds into what was briefly spoken about before the pushing the record button, this idea of like Mark Fisher's focus on depression. Like you were saying, is like maybe that needs to be redirected in terms of, when I say depression, but addiction, and that sort of pace of the internet, and there's always something new, there's always something to check. How that plays into, I guess, into the hands of all these data companies. But also there's another side to this, which is just that you sort of make the point in your book that however, the quote is, however compelling the left narrative of a class underdogs rising up, deposing their overlords and founding the fairest society known to humankind, is, it perennially fails to gain electoral votes. So as depressing as that is, like, is it that you can use the internet, this sort of addiction angry machine, to subvert or to tell, to subvert the system and or tell a compelling narrative? I mean, the sort of QAnon and Pizzagate stuff, which you mentioned, sort of actually mobilized a whole bunch of people to, invade the Capitol. So it's like, you don't necessarily want the same sort of outcome, but like the idea that you riled up a bunch of people to go do something is, it's kind of impressive is probably the wrong word, but it certainly led to action. So do you think there's anything, if this narrative has failed traditionally, do you see there being one on the left?
Yeah, I mean, it's puzzling as to why there isn't, except that I think maybe the narratives are so deep rooted, we can't really try and write one or foster one. I think that the fact that the narratives that emerge from the right are just so bizarre suggests that archetypes are being tapped into, or rather archetypes are emerging spontaneously. I mean, a lot of the dialogue around QAnon is similar to dialogue around the Nazi Party in the 20s and 30s in Germany about foreigners or the leftist elite or liberal elite being blood-sucking witches or vampires that will steal your babies. These things are common to both the Nazi kind of narrative and the QAnon narrative, which is very interesting. And I don't think somebody said literally, let's just copy the Nazi narrative. I think that these stories emerge. They're also kind of in myth and folkloric tales. They just emerge from somewhere in the mind, and the left can try and emulate that. But these things don't really seem very, very relevant to the left. They seem a bit, stupid and kind of unreasonable and crazy. And so, we're trying to just push, why don't we have a fair society? And it's not what, unfortunately, ignites the mind of people under a lot of pressure, or maybe some of the masses at certain points in history under extreme pressure, they seem to gravitate towards these kind of archetypes. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, if you're looking for a kind of a heroic story, which people seem to be looking for, why is the story of making the fairest society known to humanity, why is that story not good enough for the American people? You think of making America great again, why wouldn't it be in a kind of leftist way? And then there's so much of the right is obviously very close to Christian extremism, however you would call this. The name escapes me, but anyway, far right Christian extremism. But there's a whole Christian story which is far more left, anarcho-communist to communist, and that doesn't seem to catch on. So yeah, how do we hijack that kind of natural process that emerges in the writing of narratives at the point when people feel threatened because they're under harsh economic conditions, and they perhaps feel threatened in other ways from an outside enemy? I don't know, really. I don't think I really come up with a solution in the book, do I?
No, it's it's just a really good point that you made. And there's a great quote in the Art Manifesto, which I'll include in the show notes as well. The act of being well in oneself and with others needs to be restored to the community as a common good, owned and operated by all. But it is fascinating that that idea is not compelling. It's sort of like the more titillating stuff is what gets people excited, not the kind of the sort of bread and butter that makes sort of life livable or possible.
Yeah, that was directed at the left as well in that Art Manifesto that you just mentioned, because of course Fisher was very down on kind of the industry around well-being and the industry around mindfulness, rightly, because there's a whole lot of stuff being sold, and also personas being sold, as in, on YouTube and Instagram, around, simply being mindful. And, the other thing is things like avoiding toxic personalities, this stuff which is really superficial and actually I don't think really helps people confront, the deep-rooted issues they may have and traumas they may have. Right. And I think Fisher is completely correct in that. But I think, there's a whole kind of whole part of his following that is just like, ragingly against any sense of well-being or meditation or what have you. So if you mention anything of that nature on some Mark Fisher social media pages, people really, they'll really attack you. And people will say, no, therapy, why therapy? The problem is capitalism. We need to get rid of capitalism. So people are actually, even, I don't think Fisher pointed at this at all, they're even against therapy of any kind, because they think, well, you shouldn't really be getting therapy. You should be fighting the capitalist establishment. So I really think we need to be careful there and maybe bring back well-being as a leftist thing.
Yeah, and enjoyment, right? And desire. Like, I think, there's the sort of a lack of joy seems to, I guess, actually be all over different political spectrums. But you sort of do mention enjoyment and desire towards the end of the book, and sort of on that train of thought of like leaning into titillation, which sort of the QAnon stuff does. Yeah, there's some interesting ways that possibly represent subversion or fighting back, which is this idea of that capitalism allows and stokes certain desires whilst, I guess, editing out other ones or trimming them. And you sort of make the point that, we need more elaborate desires, whether they're political, sexual, or fantastical. You sort of give the example of this lady selling bathwater, which I thought was kind of funny. I don't know if you want to talk about that, or what, or how you see these sort of more elaborate desires being, how they might manifest.
Well, yeah, I was talking about Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School, because the book talks about Mark Fisher, but it addresses also the Frankfurt School, because the Frankfurt School wrote before, during, and after World War II. And when I say that, I mean one kind of generation of the Frankfurt School. I think it was actually the second generation of the Frankfurt School. So figures like Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, and Walter Benjamin was kind of on the periphery. They basically were all exiled German Jews who were running from Nazi Germany. And they all wrote critical theory that looked at society and culture and the links between culture and, but I mean, media and arts and politics. And one of these figures, Marcuse, lived in America in his period of exile and actually didn't go back to Germany. But at some point, Adorno and Horkheimer also lived in America. Marcuse, while in America, wrote a book called One Dimensional Man, it just did brilliantly well. It just sold, even by today's standards, the figures are insane. I think it was well over 100,000, in its, I think it's in its first year. And it's actually quite a dense, theoretical work, but got this kind of mass following because it just happened to coincide with a student movement and hippie movement, anti-war movement, etc. In the late 60s. So what he basically says is that capitalism kind of co-opts desire and makes people desire for something that's kind of a second, it's a second-rate version of what they really want. And I say that this is still happening. If it was happening then, it was certainly happening now. And I make the example of this online figure, Belle Delphine, who sold her bathwater and also made she at one point she told her fans that she was going to go on Pornhub and finally do porn, because she was already kind of titillating people, but she would never gone that far. She ended up, doing a load of spoof porn videos, and people got kind of really, shall we say, excited, and then they got annoyed. But then she actually went the whole way and really did a porn video for her only, I think it was her OnlyFans supporters. And I kind of said, well, that's the one thing not that she shouldn't have done it, but it's the one thing that kind of ruined her whole shtick, because her whole shtick was kind of titillating but not really going the whole way. I mean, I suppose in a way she's kind of proof that nothing really does titillate anymore in that sense. But I think more the point I was making was that, well, actually, I mean, in this situation, sometimes it does feel, and I must say, rarely, but that there is a vision of a woman being fully in control and just making a lot of money off, for example, OnlyFans, and them not having any kind of, manager, or shall we say middleman, or what have you. And that kind of, it blows out the water a lot of arguments about desire and a lot of prudish arguments about pornography. But my argument was that in a society where one really did what they desired, or where our desires weren't distorted by capitalism, would anyone be selling sexual imagery online in that way? Would they feel they had to? If society had its priorities in the right place, then people wouldn't want to, be making money anyway through online personas in this way that, it really draws the famous figure, the internet famous figure. It really draws them into an addiction, the same as the person who's paying subscription fees. They often, these people look ruined. They look like they can't really get out of their situation. Actually, there was one, Amaranth. She's a Twitch streamer, and it just emerged recently that her husband, which she kept a secret, had been really pushing her to carry on doing sexual things, not because it being Twitch, which is a streaming service in which you can't do anything pornographic. It was more, just there's this whole hot tub craze on Twitch where women get these kind of plastic, almost like paddling pools, but they're hot tubs, and they're in the hot tubs in their bikinis, and they talk to their mostly male followers like that. And it turned out that she basically wasn't allowed to stop because her husband ran all her accounts, and he was the kind of business head behind the whole thing. And eventually she just got really, angry about the situation, and she had a full-blown argument with him on her stream. And she put him on speakerphone, and he was like screaming, "I'm going to kill your dogs." I mean, it's not funny, but it's kind of bizarre. I mean, the thing is, she always looked not that happy, somehow a bit stressed behind it, certainly at points. Right. So the whole thing then makes sense. And then you wonder, okay, so not everyone has got a husband who's making them, be on OnlyFans or Twitch or whatever, Twitch in a bikini or whatever. But, do they have to have literally the husband to be under pressure to do it? Because society is exerting a pressure such that this seems like a good idea, whereas in a healthy society, perhaps it wouldn't seem like a good idea.
As you said, like, quote unquote, a healthy society, then you actually have the option to do that or not, right? Like at the minute, you cannot remove the possibility that there is a sort of general coercion or pressure to do it, either monetary or sort of expectations of, that you have to monetize your sex appeal or something, like at the minute, we just don't know because we don't live in that world.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not like saying anything against people doing this, either the people running the channels who are taking the money or the people who are paying money to watch these things. My point more is, okay, so there's some aspect of desire there, but would the desire play out in the same way in a different society? Is that anyone's fantasy to be a person who is offering services in this way, or to be a person who is paying for those services? Surely the ideal fantasy would be something very remote from that.
You talk about the sort of dialectical image. Is that relevant? Like, what would be your definition of that?
Dialectical image is a term that appears in Walter Benjamin's writing. So basically, I cover equally Adorno, Benjamin, and at points talk about how they intersect with Fisher's thought, simply because, as I was saying earlier, but I suppose I didn't really finish that. is that they emerged from a period of great upheaval, to say the least, a period of horror during World War II and the aftermath. And we came through, obviously, recently COVID. I was writing the book during COVID lockdown. And then, of course, we're thinking about climate catastrophe. And now we have this war in Ukraine, although that wasn't going on when I wrote the book. So, I was thinking, how do these figures deal with catastrophe then? And does that give us any information on how we can deal with it now? But at the same time, I was thinking about Fisher's, formulation around capitalism and depression. So I kind of weaved the Frankfurt School and Fisher kind of together, and then I dip in and out of Adorno, Benjamin, and Marcuse, but predominantly Adorno and Benjamin. So I talk about Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin's thing was he was heavily into flaneurism, which is this trend, 19th century trend for walking around Paris. So basically very wealthy young people, young adults used to dress up very nicely and just walk around Paris in a sauntering kind of way, as if they had no cares in the world. And that was almost, that was a fashion to appear like you were so affluent that you didn't need to do anything but walk around Paris looking very attractive. And Benjamin, who was in Paris in the 1920s and 30s, so he fled Nazi Germany. He fled Germany. He left Germany before the Nazis got into power, but stayed outside Germany, stayed in Paris, and then the Germans caught up with him, so to speak, because obviously the Nazis took over northern France. So Benjamin in Paris reenacted, the kind of behavior of the flaneurs as a bourgeois son of very wealthy German Jewish parents. And he basically just used to walk around the arcades of Paris and look at the architecture of these arcades. So these arcades were made in the 1800s. They expressed to him something about this boom, this capitalist boom of that period, about industrialization. So his feeling was that through looking at the arcades, through looking at the things that were sold in these covered shopping arcades, and through looking at the architecture and through drawing what he called constellations between different objects he saw, he could better understand the history that had led up to capitalism in his period. So he wanted to understand his period in the 1920s, 30s by kind of excavating the past through these kind of sauntering walks as a kind of flaneur. He felt that at certain points you see images, which he called the dialectical image, which intersect past and present in a kind of crystallized moment. And those can reveal to you kind of the glimpses of truth in regard of the material reality we exist in. So it's similar really to his idea of the constellation. So, it's the idea that objects can reveal the material history of the world. So your question really was the dialectical image. So I basically say in the book that the internet today is a bit like our arcade. And there are people who are on the internet very much like flaneurs. They're there to kind of say, I don't care. I don't really need to do anything. I'm just on the internet. Mm. And so they express that maybe through selfies on Instagram, or they might express it just by being deeply dismissive and sarcastic. So I want to compare our period with that period and say, well, if he could go around the arcades of Paris looking at different capitalist objects and seeing them as constellations that could reveal something about the history of the world, then we could do the same with online culture. We've got all this stuff. And although it's very hard to read anything into it because there's just so much stuff, we can maybe just take disparate, weird things on the internet, like distasteful memes and, rubbish on online shopping sites, etc., and kind of ask, well, how the hell did we get here? And by looking at these objects, maybe you can trace back, the history of capitalism and understand why things are so messed up now.
There's that quote: "We cannot construct a meaningful identity out of the things we see all around us today." I guess people are, and it either works for them or it doesn't, right? Like, am I misunderstanding that statement?
Look, there's this very famous quote that always comes up with Walter Benjamin. He talks about Paul Klee's Angel of History, this drawing by Paul Klee. And the actual drawing itself is almost cartoon-like, but it depicts an angel. And then what Benjamin says about it, I think, is actually much deeper than the drawing. So the drawing and the quote from Benjamin now going hand in hand. And that's, I guess, the two reinforce each other. But I think that what Benjamin has to say is somehow somehow, we wouldn't be looking at the drawing if it wasn't for what Benjamin had to say about it. So what he says is that there's an angel of history that looks back upon the scattered debris, that's accumulated since the beginning of time. This is paraphrasing, but he looks back upon the scattered debris of history. The suggestion is that history is a kind of explosion, and we're kind of regressing from the explosion, the catastrophe, and looking back on the kind of strewn remains of history. And the point of Benjamin's constellations, therefore, is that we're looking back on this debris of history, and we have the opportunity to try and reconfigure it in new ways, to take certain bits and maybe make something good out of it, or to reassemble it. So that being the case, we just have so much on the internet that's available to us, then perhaps we've never been in a better position than we're in now to look back on history and to take bits and with the full view of history to try and understand how we got here, and then to try and not be here anymore, to try and make something better. Who is really looking at the stuff we have in the world and putting it together in different fancy configurations and trying to make sense of it. And this is kind of does relate to what you just said, the question you asked. Young people, perhaps with too much time on their hands, are the ones that are in a position to do this, and they're actually doing it. So you're right. I mean, people do construct identities from the nonsense they find online, but what's to say they can't construct something good? We need to encourage them, I think, to understand what it is that they have in front of them, perhaps.
I wanted to go back. Ikoi, I don't know if you had any thoughts during the flow of all of that stuff.
No, I'm having a great time listening.
Okay. I wanted to return maybe towards something you said at the beginning, which relates towards the end of the book, this idea of almost bringing some sort of spirituality stuff back. I wondered if you wanted to sort of expand on that, because I assume it fits with sort of this idea of the acid left thing that Mark Fisher was writing but didn't finish.
Yeah, I mean, Fisher was writing a book called Acid Communism. Basically, he talks about how we need to form a countercultural movement, and that this would operate through seminars, reading groups, support groups. I don't remember the exact terms, but community building operations that would use our creative capacities. And he very much based this on the counterculture of the 60s, and he talks about Marcuse a lot in the introduction to the unfinished book. So the introduction to the unfinished book is available online and in a compendium of Fisher writers. A compendium of Fisher writings. Yeah, I mean, I got very interested in this idea. The term acid communism is a little bit tricky. I think Fisher, if he was with us, would be suffering a little bit, because I ran a podcast called The Acid Left for I think over a year with a poet and artist called Adam Ray Adkins, who's based in Florida. Mm-hmm. And it did pretty well, but one of my gripes, and maybe one thing that led me to stop, and then shortly afterwards Adam also stopped, or certainly there's been a hiatus for a while now. One of the things is that people are always like, so do you do acid? Should we do acid? And actually, Fisher doesn't really say anything about doing acid. I mean, I think he mentions an acid trip that Foucault took in that introduction, if I remember correctly. But he doesn't suggest that one needs to take acid. And actually, I think he spoke about the corrosive effects of acid as much as the hallucinatory effects. So acid as this substance that corrodes things, and acid as something that gives you hallucinations. These two different substances, effectively, both as being things that blur the edges. So we have imposed false edges in society, and acid communism is about corroding and making those edges fantastical and and hallucinatory. But there was no injunction to do drugs there. And of course, I'm fully aware that Fisher may have done. I heard that he did do LSD in his later years, as he was, building up to writing that. I don't know the exact details. I didn't actually know that till quite recently. But it's a fair bet that he may well have. But my thing is not that one should or one shouldn't. It's just that one gets held to that quite a lot. If you have a podcast called The Acid Left, then you're often asked questions about doing acid. And And I think from Fisher's introduction to the unfinished book, it's quite clear he means we need to find ways to break down false structures, rationalist structures where rationality has kind of gone awry and it's become something very restrictive. Not that we should be anti-rationality as such. So I worked with that in the book, and actually I think it's a really important thing that through obviously hallucinogens as an option, but also meditation, actually also exercise, prayer, psychotic experience, although it's not something that one should aim for. Through all of these things we can lose sight of the boundary between inner and outer, between ourselves and the world, okay? Which is what people who take hallucinogens or smoke pot or whatever, they say that it got fuzzy, I was part of everything, we're all one, etc., etc. Well, that is of course true in many ways, but though as human beings we experience things as individuals, and that's also fundamental. We can't operate without doing that. But I think it's very important that we have ways of escaping the subject-object binary, which leads to conflict constantly, because we are basically terrified of the outside of ourselves and the fact of our mortality, which I touched upon before. But I'm quite big on this. I just find it somehow a really important thing. I think basically humans, there's a kind of originary fear historically, but also in each human, a moment of panic and perhaps also awe at the fact of us being mortal. It's something that we revisit as individuals often in our lives. And I think it leads us to set up all kinds of barriers to try and strengthen ourselves, to try and resist mortality as far as we can. And that ultimately leads to conflict and to scapegoating and to seeing the as Adorno talks about in the dialectic of enlightenment, or Adorno and Horkheimer talk about in the dialectic of enlightenment, which they wrote in the 1940s, there's this tendency to see certain other people as being dirty, as being dirt, because of course the thing is we all will be dirt effectively. So I think this is basically it's a fear of death, and it's an extension of that. So we fear death, and then we get around this by identifying weaknesses in the other and in nature. So I think anything which can lead us to temporarily forget our boundaries as a kind of exemplar of how things can be is really useful, although that forgetting of one's boundaries will never last. Adorno saw this in the artwork, and he said that through certain abstract artworks, because they're abstract, meaning they have no discernible form, when we look into them or when we listen to music, which is the most abstract art form, we get lost and we can no longer feel our edges. So we've all had that experience of listening to music, and you're kind of floating. And at some point you listen to the music, you're floating, and something brings you back into yourself. And when you're brought back into yourself, that's when you think, I was floating. Because when you're actually floating, you're not really aware. When you're lost, you're not really aware. But then you realize what you've lost, and you want to regain that sensation of being somehow lost or feeling one with everything. And then you might, then try and make movements, political movements, social movements, have gatherings, talk to people about these experiences, which is what people who take hallucinogens do, So, Fisher's acid communism movement was very much about recreating that. And he actually said that psychedelia in the 60s, it seeped into everyday culture in the UK. You had radio, you had TV programs that were really off the wall. So there was a whole kind of potential of people in kind of absorbing this psychedelic aesthetic in then questioning the class system, for example, because that's about boundaries. That's something he actually says, not something I'm just kind of ad-libbing there. I find that all fascinating. So in the book, I kind of talk about one of the most irrational things to do, certainly in the capitalist age, is simply to help other people for the sake of it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I say we should kind of tap into and not see that as a bad thing. So why they're called an acid left? Because I didn't want to talk about acid communism because then you get into communism. So the thing with acid communism, the problem I find is that you're either talking about acid or you're talking about communism. And actually, if you think about the term acid communism, they're both correctives to each other. The acid is a corrective to communism and the totalitarian aspect, because acid, you can't really be totalitarian if you're hallucinating on acid. And, the structure of communism is an antidote to the kind of the formless aspect of hallucinating. But, what people tend to do is they tend to pull you up on the acid or the communism. So you get the people who say, okay, do you do acid? And there are many acid purists who gravitate around the acid communist movement. But then you get people who say, well, communism is really bad because of Stalin, etc. So I didn't want to end up, arguing on both fronts. So we called the podcast, which we used to run, me and Adam, the Acid Left, instead. So in the book, I talk about the acid left, and I suggest an acid left would be a movement in which we're happy to to do the irrational, to maybe apply the notion of abstraction in art and of having no real meaning or no structure, apply that to politics, and then that meaning that we might be invited to freely help one another in a way that I don't know if I actually say it there, but in a way that I think there kind of sounds a bit like the Gospels. Yeah.
That idea essentially of just helping out other people, and particularly people that you find politically the other end of the spectrum, I think is quite a sort of powerful idea, because then there's a sort of it runs on its own logic, separate from the sort of day-to-day thing of needing to pay bills and earn money, etc.
Yeah, that was, I suppose, my argument was that there is there's such a hold of numeracy, profit over everyday life, and something about the artwork resists that. So could we apply that to to politics, to society, this abstract element which resists the numerical count, and then if you resist the numerical count, then you're free to do things that make no sense. And in terms of profit, in terms of accumulation, then simply helping other people doesn't make any sense. Or even because you're just making them stronger when you might be making yourself stronger. So it's just like it's a trade-off. So people will be like, why are you doing that? Why aren't you focusing on yourself? And I think that does just tie into simple economics and investments in energies and things, and that all simply being about accumulation, and it doesn't need to be. So yeah, I think that's what I was pointing at there.
Yeah, and the idea that art as a redemptive force, again, the term art seems to be kind of broad generally, or at least that's how I interpret it. Whether that is music or some sort of visual medium, or again, I would stretch it to that art could be exactly what you just said, which is doing things for other people. That in itself is like a massively creative act, given the context we all live in.
Yeah, I mean, there's I think a much more convoluted trajectory there. I'm not sure actually if I could go into it now.
No worries.
It goes back to Kant. It's touched upon in that chapter as well. But I think I will spare you that. But basically, though, it has to do with Kant's formulation of beauty. Okay, so basically, he says that there are experiences which are useful to us, and there is an experience which leaves us in a kind of awe, and that is not useful at all. And that is the experience of looking at natural beauty, because when you look at a mountain range, for example, you don't know what you're looking at. You can't fully comprehend what you're looking at. Perhaps scale wise, but also formally, because it has such a kind of undulating, changing form. And Kant basically says, because you don't know what you're looking at, and because it elicits that experience from you of being kind of suspended in your judgment, that you're not able to say what you're looking at, you have to assume that anyone else would have the same experience at the same time. So it must be what he calls an example of the sensus communis, the common sense, what Kant was actually looking for in terms of ethics, but which he couldn't ever really find. So he uses the existence of natural beauty and our kind of response to it as an exemplar of how we could have a common ethics. But I think if you could kind of take this aesthetic response to beauty and meld it with politics, you would have a situation in which you were doing things not because they were useful, but because you would be doing things for no reason. You'd be suspending any judgment or any reason in the same way we do when we look at something that's beautiful. So that does leave open altruistic acts. So that's the kind of longer form of why I think that we could come up with a politics which somehow reverts back to, shall we say, Buddhism and Christianity. I don't want to say Christianity without saying Buddhism, because otherwise I get in murky waters.
Yeah. Ikoi, have you got any thoughts about that stuff? I realise we've hit the hour, so I don't know if you have anything to wrap up.
No, one of the things that, that was being talked about how being kind to others, right, is kind of against the, without a payback, right, or benefit to the person doing it, of just like this, one-way generosity is against capitalism is one of the things that, like, I think, so much of social skills is developed through positive interaction with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of the ability to not feel isolated is based on positive interaction with other people. Because one of the things about this, improve yourself mentality on the right that is a lot more conservative is about like the perfection of self. Rather than like these better, ability for better interaction with others. Because that's ultimately kind of, so much, even so much of, addiction treatment or so much about poverty is there is a base in abandonment in a lot of how we treat those people. Like, if you have grown up in poverty, right, in order to move up in the world, you kind of have to abandon all your friends, your old neighborhood, you move away to better pastures, so to speak. Same with, addiction, right? Is that like, if you have a drug use issue, one of the most basic suggestions often made without a lot of qualifications, without really talking to people, is like, oh, you should stop talking to all your friends that are using.
I think that, this, in the kind of simple formulation that capitalism causes depression, we miss so many other aspects which are really useful. I think it's brilliant that capitalist realism, Fisher's capitalist realism, has become so big and has, been picked up on by so many, young people discovering left-wing philosophy for the first time and critical theory for the first time. But there's a tendency for the debate to be narrowed on some of the kind of platforms where Fisher is discussed, because the book is quite small, and it says only a few things, being a small book. It says them brilliantly, and it leaves open room for discussion. But I think people can be, purists. So we get to capitalism causes depression, and it stops there. And I think if you really look at it on a societal level, are we really talking about depression? Even with a lot of people who are depressed, are we talking just about depression? Because, I think where Fisher talks about somehow weaponizing depression, to greatly paraphrase what he said, but actually Liam, you quoted earlier what he says at that point. But let me find the part he says is, we must convert widespread mental health problems from medicalized conditions into effective antagonisms. Okay, so that is pretty, I think you actually quoted it exactly earlier, Liam, as well. So we need to convert these mental health problems into effective antagonisms. We need to kind of make them useful in the battle against capitalism. That can we really ever make depression useful as depression against capitalism? Because when you're depressed, anyone who's been depressed, you don't go and fight capitalism. You don't do very much. So if you're able to convert it, it's becoming something else. Either you emerge from your depression into whatever a stable and sane persona is, or perhaps you fluctuate between depression and a kind of hypomania or mania, which I think is something that happens if we are to use these words analogously, by analogy. Because I'm not a mental health specialist, so I don't want to say that everyone is either depressed or in a state of hypomania, because that's not true. But I think anyway, we're often talking in terms of in analogous terms when we're talking about capitalism and depression, because we're not, at any point passing judgment on the mental health state of all the people who are adversely affected by capitalism. We're saying that broadly, there's kind of societal malaise, which we could call depression. I don't think it is just a depression. I think it's a depression that tips over into a high, and you get this constant fluctuation, which comes down to, I think, the basic, again, the fact of our loss or feeling of loss and despair, our own vulnerability. So you become depressed, but then you find things that bring you out, that take you out of that depression, be they alcohol or other drugs, or using the internet or what have you. Okay, there are many different things that people do to momentarily emerge from their despair. But it's a dynamic which is constant. And it's a dynamic which unfortunately feeds back into capitalism, because it keeps selling us the way out, only to have us then plummet again to then need to buy the way out. So that was just following on some things you were saying there. But what do you make of that?
Well, one aspect of it is we spoke to Douglas Rushkoff, who'd recently written this book, Survival of the Richest, and he was in a room with a bunch of billionaires who were trying to figure out how to survive, the apocalypse, basically, and how that they would be able to pay or their bodyguards when money doesn't exist anymore, and how do they get loyalty and all that kind of stuff, right? And it was an interesting conversation, but the point being is, like, there's clearly some members of the super rich who are equally as fucked in the head, just in a completely different way. And not that being depressed is like wrong. I'm not making that point, but I am just saying that, like, and you had sort of said this in your book as well, that everyone's compromised by this situation, even the quote unquote winners, right? That for those people, the billionaires, they didn't even have the imagination or the kind of ability to think about what you just said about being kind to other people. That was Douglas Rushkoff's point. Like, hey, if you're actually just nice to people, they won't want to kill you, Mm-hmm. So there's something about the idea of kindness. There's something about the idea of creativity in service of finding other ways. And I think that why creativity, there's a very interesting book called, I think, Against Creativity, which he's just making the point, I'm only about halfway through it, but he's making the point that creativity is used often by the state, the neoliberal state, as a front to cut funding for things. Like, just be creative, find another way, like telling nurses and doctors to be creative, when they actually just need resources and time, etc. So there clearly is a sort of screwed up way of using creativity, but I think that it offers hope, and not necessarily hopium, but it offers the possibility of completely different things. Even the billionaires lack that. Their money doesn't buy them that. They need creative people, creative individuals in order to thrive. So you have to find a way to keep that shit for yourself, to not have it all be monetized. And I wonder, we have caring professions and stuff, so that is caring for people. So that has been commodified in care homes, etc.
Well, one aspect of creativity I think that's often missed is, like, creativity is seen as an outcome, a product that can be consumed by other people. But I think the most important aspect of creativity is problem solving.
Yeah.
It's about expression, or it's about problem solving. It's about, something other than the consumable product. And it's, also what it does for the people in the process of doing these things. Like, I mean, one of my friends, he's a musician, and he will say that he's a terrible musician. I mean, he's a musician in not as a career, but as something that he loves to do. He's had a really hard life. He went through years of therapy, and one of the major things that he really enjoyed about music was that it helped him process his therapy. Because, after a session, you're just oftentimes overwhelmed if you're, trying to work through some traumatic things. And it was a way of, how he would just process everything, after a session, a really stressful session, by playing music. To him, ultimately meant more than ever being good in an instrument enough to play in front of people.
Yeah, I think that just doing something for the sake of it means a lot. I mean, I suppose that whole thing of just being in the moment, which you are when you play an instrument, sometimes, or when you're making art, and that thing of making a pact with the object, as in we're subjects and everything else is an object. When you're making music or art, you really do. You're interacting with your hands and your body with nature. And you have to kind of come to an agreement with it, and you lose your mind. You're not really thinking when you're doing that. So I think that these are really useful activities which teach us a lot, and I think that if we have this constant fear which we treat with substances or activities which we're basically hooked on, then the way out would be, I mean, obviously you have to deal with, if you have physical addictions, etc., you have to deal with those. You have to taper off a drug in that case. But, the way to long-term get off those things would be to no longer have the original fear which led to them. And I think, if we're talking about a societal malaise, then, society needs to get over this collective fear we have of nature, of the outside. And individuals also need to be able to deal with that. So, if the problem is we're societally, we're hooked on ways of ignoring reality, we need to address that. We need to be able to calm ourselves in the face of reality. And part of that, can happen through music and art, but also in ways of gathering with people when you're not terrified of each other. So it follows that if you manage to build a community that functions really as a community where people feel comfortable with each other, then you've already got rid of the fear of the other.
Yeah, and I thought that interesting. I don't know if this was me paraphrasing from your book, but that in general, art does have the power to refuse certain value systems, and that play itself is sort of a refusal to comply with rules. And, in play and art, to me, my association with them is that they are enjoyable activities a lot of the time. And again, it just sort of just comes back to that sort of like, whatever the revolution is, it better be fun.
Yeah.
Because what the fuck are we all doing here otherwise?
That is true. That's true, yeah. I just don't know where that's coming from now at the moment. I mean, certainly, of course, there are, again, pockets, but I don't know where you live, Liam. Are you from the UK?
Yeah. I'm in the UK, yeah.
I lived in London. Whenever I go back, it just seems that so much of the raw spirit, the anarchic spirit has been pushed out. That just things every time you go back aren't the same. So I remember going back quite a few years ago, and I had to get from the airport. Maybe it was Heathrow or Gatwick. I had to get all the way to Hackney. So I was on a long bus ride from Victoria Station, and just a lot of the areas which I had taken to be kind of party areas that were a little bit wild in the centre. Just there was nothing there. The bars just weren't open, or they didn't have the same sense of anarchy around them. Things had just changed, and then the structure had changed. There were concrete bollards everywhere. These concrete, structures that appeared across Europe in cities city centres that basically they stop vehicles going anywhere, but also I think they're pretty good for crowd control. But yeah, it's just felt hollowed out, and then all the way up to going into Hackney past Old Street, which used to be a really anarchic area, even in the early 2000s. Old Street and Shoreditch. I mean, obviously Shoreditch is a whole thing that was quite wild in the late 90s, early 2000s, but now it's like a banker's playground. It's just been completely killed.
Yeah, there's a very good book called Alpha City, which is well worth a read, sort of talking about how London got owned by the super rich and how the architecture and everything had to change to sort of facilitate how they would want the city to be, which I think goes some way to explaining that thing. Yeah, I also I will send you a link to the book because it's quite interesting. But yeah. I spent quite a lot when I first moved there. I was in West Ferry, which was actually kind of really cheap to live in. It was like a ex-council houses, I think. But it was just like a 10-minute walk, and you cross the DLR and then you're in Canary Wharf. And walking around that place always felt incredibly surreal because it's very much like a video game. You're walking around I think even Mark Fisher might have talked about this, like these banks, these glass towers, they all have this sort of video game virtual reality aesthetic to them. And there are definitely benefits to somewhere like Canary Wharf. I mean, it's completely privately owned as a place, but it's incredibly clean. The place, there's definitely parts of London you walk around and it just doesn't feel like a happy place, And Canary Wharf, I'm not sure it's a happy place, but it's certainly any element of chaos has been removed, right? Rubbish included.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's areas there where you really feel, you could do something. You could get a group of people down there. There's no one around, and you could maybe have some kind of happening in the street or something. But of course, you probably couldn't. Probably it would be shut down by private security quite quickly. I'm not sure what would happen.
Yeah.
But I wonder. I suppose my point was what space there is for not just physically but just otherwise for a countercultural movement to emerge. Because when I wrote the book, I thought, well, lockdown will finish and people who have been denied the kind of rite of passage going to university, or just being young and then starting to go out clubbing or whatever, they will suddenly want to go out, and then a lot of people will also just be leaving the house for the first time, and many of them will be jobless and just won't have money and will be fed up. So there'll be some kind of countercultural movement, but of course it didn't happen. Then you think, well, how will it ever happen then?
Well, one of the things about the pandemic is that I know you mentioned dirt earlier in the pandemic, but there is an understandable but still ultimately, I think, negative impact of seeing other people as dirty vectors of disease that, and how that kind of impacts people.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It's very complicated because of course there's so many aspects of random interaction which are kind of undesirable anyway. So if part of me was thinking, this is quite nice being in lockdown, being in lockdown, and actually thinking, well, pubs, what are they? They're kind of horrible. And then, the idea that, one in England, I guess it's 16 or 14, as long as you can, as early as you can get served. And I had much older brothers, so I could, get into these places. You socialize there. You get socialized. You go through the social process you're supposed to go through to become a young adult, often in bar environments. When I think of it now, and having students as well, having taught for a few years, I think, it's kind of horrible when it just feels this is really lame in a way. It feels unsafe. It just feels like, is that the right thing? Because in terms of, having your period of socialization, are you having it with the right people? Like ignoring, your own family members and the good people you're with. If you're so lucky, then the other people who are preying on, the fact that there being many young people out in those situations, the whole thing doesn't seem like a very responsible way to bring people up into the world. Surely there'll be better ways, but the ways that are emerging would just be to have no pub and to have no social space. So we're not getting anything better. So it does go back to Fisher's vision of acid communism and kind of learning networks and reading groups and whatever, spaces, communities in which we can teach each other to be unafraid. I think that's what we need. The whole thing about, I suppose, the thing of getting people through this process as young people, in pubs is also teaching them to be unafraid. But it's a bit like, it's a white knuckle experience, and one in which you need to be, drunk or otherwise off your head to get through often. So I think it's good that some ways have been abandoned, but there's nothing growing up to replace those. And it's quite clear that what the system really would benefit from is these things not being replaced, and then just us being atomized individuals, which is what we need to resist. But how do we resist that?
Has sort of acts of kindness or just helping other people, has that been commodified yet?
I mean, it's kind of interesting how, one of the major things that like you see in a lot of therapy abuse spaces, where people are talking about, experience with therapy, but also experience with community, oftentimes is kind of how help has become professionalized, where like a lot of people are being, if they just want to discuss their problems with a friend is, much more likely to be like, oh God, no, you should go talk to that in therapy. Don't talk to that with me. Kind of,
right.
Becoming a lot more commonplace with people. And that is a certain, it's not just a commodification of altruism and help, but like, a commodification and also like a certification of being able to, because a lot of times what is generally often, when people say like therapy works, right, is, that somebody else understands where they're coming from and what they're experiencing, and it's kind of sad that we now have a culture where that is, expected to mostly happen with a impersonal relationship, right? Because that's kind of, there are benefits to the impersonal relationship in therapy, absolutely. But there are also downsides. It's not just positives, and ultimately, I think good therapy is one that can help people have more of these experiences in their personal relationship. But now we've gotten to the point where that's gotten so commodified that, people are basically just punting any kind of, personal discomfort or listening about something that might make them uncomfortable too.
Right, they're trying to swipe real life. No, don't want it. Right, yeah.
Because I think like kind of, that's one of the aspects of there are, people that are, against therapy, that are just like, oh, they should just be, doing activism or making for revolution, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are people that are pro-therapy to the point of being antisocial. And I think that's kind of one of the issues of, punting everything to a professional is being pro to the point of antisocial, if that makes sense.
I think that is the case in certain affluent professional cultures, that people may be over-reliant on various therapies for human contact. Yep. I was thinking actually though of a strange space in which community might emerge, and I've been kind of going down the survivalism and prepper wormhole on YouTube. And I found it very interesting. So yeah, I mean, survival is just this massive thing. I don't know if it's like this where you are, but I'm finding in Finland supermarkets are full of survival gear now. You know, you've got your knives and your camping stoves and whatever, but what maybe just was sold as camping gear is more and more sold as survival gear. And of course, a lot of the YouTubers who talk about survival and you know, it's massive. They have followings much bigger than the left political YouTubers. They're trying to sell things. So they're saying, you know, you need this if you want to survive. So it's obviously it's a very lucrative industry, and it's very good for being a YouTuber, because you get to scare the crap out of people saying that, you know, the world's basically ending, and then come back next time to hear more about how to survive. I mean, it's very cynical in that way. But one thing that's come up, it comes up with a few of the people there, a few of the major figures, is that you might get all your survival gear, your generators, your knives, your water purification equipment, etc., your stash of food, but you're not surviving if your neighbors don't get on with you, because they're going to be after your stuff. So you're going to have to build a community to survive. And that's weird that it emerges from that space of, you know, extreme individualist survival and the need for it. So who knows in these tough times if maybe community will rise out of necessity.
Right. I mean, you know, climate change and natural disasters can have been impacting people severely for some time now. One of the downsides of a lot of the climate change impacts is that it breaks community rather than builds them, because like if you look at places like, you know, New Orleans after Katrina, you know, people left and, you know, went to wherever help or jobs or whatever was offered, and they never came back.
Interesting.
Well, you know, that would contradict entirely what I was saying or proposing there. But I suppose that they're saying that if you do it properly, then that wouldn't happen.
Right. I mean, you know, it's a community that I, you know, kind of look at every now and then. I'm actually part of, you know, several Facebook groups, just because I like to listen to the conversation. And there are ones that are a lot more like communal based, that are trying to build what would look more like a lot more mutual aid within like local communities. Right. You know, so there was one lady that was that lived in Colorado that was basically kind of like, hey, like, you know, if you live within like a certain, you know, area of this place, like, you know, apparently she lives on like a relative amount of land. So she was trying to get a group of people where like if an emergency was to happen and her place was like a decent place to kind of for everyone to congregate, right, and stay until things got better. She was just like, what's your skill set? These are mine. I'm looking for people who are good with this, and this. Because one aspect of like there's prepperism is consumerism, like you've mentioned. Right. And then there are people that are much more serious about it who practice these skills, right? Because it's not just about having the right equipment. It's actually having practice in using the equipment.
Yeah, it sounds very much like The Walking Dead made real.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you do have to wonder, like, yeah, maybe they got a point.
I mean, it's one of those things where, yeah, like if you live in a somewhat rural, I mean, you know, even in, you know, big cities, when something big happens, it is chaotic. You know, help isn't necessarily coming for you in any kind of timely manner.
Yeah, I mean, during COVID, when all the supermarkets were getting sort of raided is a strong word, but it was quite strange sort of walking around and being like, man, there is just not a lot here. It was like, okay, this is a small taste of what societal collapse would be like. So I understand the impulse, but I think, you know, I guess time will tell who's right, I guess. But I just wonder if it's all just an illusion that even just a small community would be able to sustain itself. I think probably the much more sort of vulnerable truth is we are completely interdependent, and no amount of gear is going to save you from
the
apocalypse.
Well, I mean, it's we are interdependent, and I think one aspect of things like climate change and the ensuing crop failures, from the changing climate is probably what's really going to do things in, right? In some ways.
Yeah. But here, have a meme.
Yes.
Yeah, Mike, I don't know if you have any sort of further thoughts or whether we should just wrap it up.
Well, yeah, I mean, no, I don't really have many further thoughts. I think there's been a lot of interesting points made. I would say something about creativity and survival, but it's not really fully formulated, so it would be a bit crass. So
no worries.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a really great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to chat with us. And I really enjoyed the memeing of Mark Fisher, and I definitely will look out for any further books that you plan.
I'm looking forward to your writings on substance use.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons: Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers-Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Belmas.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.